marriage, the most sacred of relationships, yet time and life make it fragile. Love, trust, respect, and desire, all elements of a successful marriage. Yet so many of us along the way forget. We lead busy lives. We go through changes, big and small. We build walls to protect ourselves. It does not have to be this way. There are clear and exciting ways to bring your marriage and life back on track. Welcome to the Couples Expert Podcast with Stuart Fensterheim.
Hello there, it's Stuart Fensterheim again for the Couples Expert Podcast. I love having guests on my show, and this guest is no different. Brian Mayer is a gentleman who I've met online, and he and I have actually done some things together. He's a couples counselor, and he just really has a lot to share with all of you. And I'm excited to talk about this topic because it's really one in which we've begun to talk a lot about. And one of the reasons that I became a couples counselor is to really blast the statistics of divorce out of our society. And what I know with the work that I do with emotionally focused therapy, as well as the attachment theory that we've talked a lot about, is really understanding that there truly is a pathway to really changing the nature of relationships where both people feel a deep sense of connection. One of the saddest statistics out there is the statistics about divorce and remarriage. As most of you probably are very much aware, the statistics show that people who have been married before and then get remarried, the rate of divorce in those marriages are astronomically high. I think it's really over 50%. And what I am really trying very hard to communicate with all of you every week on this show is that there is a method to stop that statistic dead in its track. What we want to do is really talk with experts, for me to share information with all of you that will allow you to really understand that if you do the work that is necessary and you are in a relationship that did not work and you're currently divorced and you're currently in a relationship with someone, that getting remarried doesn't have to be scary. It doesn't have to be one of those things where you just cross your fingers, cross your toes, and hope it's going to work. That there really is a way to assure yourself and your partner that this relationship will be the last one. And Brian, who has a podcast and as well as a practice that deals with people who have been married before. He is a counselor out of Richmond, Virginia, working with couples and really specializing in the remarried life. And he has a podcast called the Remarried Life Podcast. He works with blended families. And basically, what he does is he helps people understand what it really does take to move past the hurts from a prior relationship and have a relationship that is secure, that is bonded, that is one in which you and your partner truly understand that you're in this world together. And if you happen to have a blended family on top of that, all of the challenges that come his way with the couples that he sees, that's what we're going to be pulling apart. So what we're going to talk about is helping Brian really share with all of us his expertise on having that special relationship. And one of the unique things is Brian has been married before, so not only is he going to be able to share the personal aspects of this, and also the professional. So we'll have someone that has lived this, that has walked the walk, and not just talked the talk. So Brian, welcome to the podcast. We're excited to have you.
Thanks so much, Stuart. It's really great to be here. I've definitely enjoyed connecting with you and learning a lot about what you do and what I do. I think we have a lot in common, I think personally and professionally. And so I'm definitely so excited to be here with you today.
Well, yeah, I loved coming on to your podcast, and I'm glad to be able to reciprocate that. And we're going to be talking a lot about your life a bit, and also, more importantly, how to help the couples really understand what it takes to have a successful relationship within a remarriage. And the question I like to ask folks when they first come on is, we work in this crazy field. And sometimes it can, we deal with all these people's pain. So I'm always interested in what brings people into working both in the mental health field, but most importantly, working with couples, because it's definitely a unique population.
Yep, you're exactly right. I think it does take a special person to be able to work with couples. And so, yeah, I actually, the first half of my career, interestingly enough, I spent in more of the business and finance world and did that, like I said, for quite a while. And I think one of the things that kind of turned me on to where I'm at today is that my wife and I got the opportunity to be what was called marriage mentors in the community, where we would actually together work with couples and help them and kind of walk alongside them and give them some tools to help them. And after a couple of years of doing that, I thought, man, I think I seem to have a little bit of a knack for this. I like doing it. I like to work with people and help people, and especially couples and marriages. And then, based upon some things that have happened in my personal life, I think you kind of roll all that up into one. And I said, I think I can make a go at this professionally. And so, yeah, here we are.
So when you talk about relating it to your personal life, the counseling was not something that you thought about when you were younger, or were you involved? Because I believe you do some work through a church as well, do you not?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, the mentoring that I was mentioning, yeah, that is actually through the church that we are associated with. And so, yeah, and I think, when you talk about when I was younger, was counseling kind of on my radar, or therapy. And I think I've always been the type that's wanted to help people. Never really thought about it as a career when I was younger and entering college. But yeah, it was just kind of one of those things. Life experiences happen. And, I've been through a divorce, and now I'm remarried, and it's a very healthy marriage. And again, my wife and I have got this same vision of helping couples. And so I think through all of that has kind of led me again to where I'm kind of at today. So yeah, just a lot of different things I think have pushed me or pulled me into what I'm doing today.
So talk a little bit about the experience, because you said that you've come both from a personal perspective as well as a professional one. And having been through a divorce, what would you say is the biggest learning curve for folks that are going through that?
When I look back on it, my divorce, I guess, was probably about 18 years ago now. And so obviously I've had a long time to look back on it. But it's, when you're in the thick of it, when it's going on, it's almost like the emotions just kind of take over. And it's so hard to know how to even put one foot in front of the other. And so, but, taking those small steps and listening to others and getting good counsel and support and things like that, I think helped me through that time. But yeah, it was just, again, just such a very difficult time. And it happened when I was younger. So I've got the, I guess, perspective and hindsight of, maturity and age and all that kind of goes into it. But yeah, definitely looking back on it, it was a very tough time.
What do you think the biggest personal challenge was?
I'd say for me in my situation, I mean, and I'll, be completely honest, I felt like I kind of lost myself as a person. I did actually, I like to kind of explain to people, if you think about a relationship sort of like two circles, and they come together and there's a piece in the middle that's shared, but there's still those outer pieces of the circle that you can see, and that are the independence, and they're the person and the individuality. Well, what actually happened with me, and I think this was my own doing, is that the circles with my ex-wife became completely overlapped. And I actually completely lost myself in the relationship. And again, was nothing that she did. There was no controlling behavior on her part. But I think it was just me, again, just kind of, again, losing myself in the relationship, losing my identity, and not realizing that. And that's definitely something I've learned in the marriage that I'm in now. We both we have our individuality, we have our own things that we do in addition to the things that we do in common. So I think that was probably the big learning for me, I think, moving forward out of that relationship.
So one of the things we've spent a lot of time here at the podcast with all of the listeners that really tune in, it tends to be because they have this sense sometimes that in their marriage, in their relationships, they can't be themselves. They can't be authentic. They can't be who they are. And as I hear you talking about losing your independence, are you really talking about that element?
Yeah, and again, I think it was, like I said, it was more of a voluntary issue on my part. I think one of the things that I remember thinking clearly was that, and we had children, we had one child together, and then she had a child from a previous relationship. So we had two in the household. And I remember saying a lot, you know what, we'll connect once the children are older, once they're out of the house. But right now the focus is the children, the focus is on the family as a whole. And I think, again, my perspective or my thoughts were skewed on that because, I mean, at the time when I said that, my daughter was, a year or two old. And so you think about, okay, that's a good 16 to 20 years away. And that's quite a long time to put, the sole focus or the main focus on the children and then kind of taking it away from the relationship. And, because of that, the relationship suffered.
Right. And I think people forget that kids go away. And
that's right.
And I think the saddest things that I've seen in my practice have been couples who've come in whose children are, 16, 17 years old and about to go off to school or to work. And they look at each other and say, I don't even know you. I don't even know if I like you. And so many people believe the philosophy that what's the most important is raising the children, as opposed that the children will be a byproduct of the couple. And if you have a life with your partner where who you are as an individual, your independence, mind you, is in a place where you can share all of those things with your best friend, the children see that and will be absolutely fine. And I think so often we put all this energy into raising children and we forget that we also have to raise our marriage.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think one of the several things that I learned from that is, because a lot of times you will hear people say, well, we shouldn't be affectionate in front of the children, or we shouldn't be going on date nights because we need to be here for the children. And, I would actually disagree with that. I would say that showing affection in front of the children is great. Saying that, hey, mom and dad need, we need to have a discussion, just the two of us. We need you to go into a separate room. This is our time. Going on a date night every so often, putting them in the hands of somebody that you trust, another family member, that's actually fine. And that's actually very healthy for children to see that. Because, if you think about, I think just like you were saying, at some point they have to go out into the world. They have to have been taught somewhere, somehow, what a healthy relationship looks like. And if you don't do those types of things, like you said, they go out of the house and then they don't know how to operate a healthy relationship in a family. So, those are some very important things that I think couples need to do, even with children. And some of them have lots of children in the house.
Right. And when you talk about date nights and the challenge for folks, if both people are working, where they're spending a lot of time away from the kids, what's your recommendation typically for those kinds of families?
Yeah, I tell people, a date night doesn't necessarily have to be a fancy restaurant and a movie where you're out of the house spending, $200 or $300 and you're gone for 5 hours. It could be something as simple as, maybe when the kids go to bed, you get a blanket out and you put it down on the living room floor and you have a little bit of, cheese and grapes and a beverage and, just spend some good quality time talking together. I mean, so it doesn't necessarily have to mean that, again, a lot of money or a lot of time. And I do tell people, pick something where you're able to talk. A lot of times my wife and I in the mentoring, we'll talk to people about doing a date night and then they'll come back next time and say, yeah, we went to a movie and then I'll say, well, did you get a chance to talk? And no, not really. We just watched the screen and, Yeah.
Right.
And so,
That's not really interactive, is it?
yeah, exactly. So we really try to let them know, hey, it's all about the quality time, and the conversation is most important.
Right. And I think the part of the picture here, though, I think is more about the balance between quality and quantity of time with the children.
Mhm.
And what I like to sort of share with folks is that, yes, there's this yearning at times because you're away at work and you're not seeing the kids. And then, here you are then going out on a date and the children haven't seen you all week, perhaps, at least not from a long-standing quality of time. But if the time that you do spend, even though it's less, you're really present because you're nurtured and you feel good about your life and you feel good about your relationship, that time, even though it's less than you normally might have, is actually better time. And that,
Yeah, I would.
and that kids would prefer that.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Stuart. Yeah, it's, when it comes to spending that good quality time with children, it's not about, I'll hear some couples say, well, they're in the room with me. I've got the TV on, I'm watching TV, and they're over playing in the corner, and, isn't that spending time together? And I mean, in absence of anything, I guess that's okay. But like you said, I mean, good quality time where you're getting down on the floor, or you're, really talking to them about the issues of the day, or, what went on at school. Tell me how that went. What are your biggest fears, your biggest worries? I mean, even asking those questions of children, I think are important for connection, like you said. So yeah, it's definitely, I agree, more about the quality of time than the quantity of time.
Let's talk about the whole concept of remarriage and making that decision. So many people are so scared of that because they've come from relationships that haven't worked. And I don't like to use the word that I hear from a lot of folks, that it was a failed marriage, because I think we have to define, what does that really mean? How would you define that marriage that wasn't successful, and how would you characterize that? Of how do you take that experience and move it into another relationship?
Yeah, definitely. So the way I look at it is, there are sort of three, I guess, entities in a relationship. There's partner number one, there's partner number two, and there's the relationship. And so, if the relationship didn't work out, again, we kind of put our eyeballs, I guess, on the relationship, that thing that's kind of in between both partners. So we don't look at it as, well, partner number one failed or partner number two failed, because that's something that you'll end up kind of taking with you if you look at it from that standpoint. But if we look at it from a standpoint of, what didn't work right in the relationship, and I think you've talked about this before, and I think it's a very good idea about the kind of doing that autopsy on the relationship itself, and just looking at what did work and what didn't work, and really kind of analyzing, I think, those things that happened in that prior relationship, and then bringing those learnings forward into the next relationship. And I'll say too that a lot of people ask me, what kind of time frame should there be from the divorce into the new relationship? And I don't like to put time frames on things, but I would say, if you can, a year. I've heard a lot of people say moving through the milestones and the anniversaries and the birthdays, are very important to do. Because that's all kind of part of the grieving process. And if you don't give that enough time, then obviously you are going to bring things from your prior relationship into that next one.
What's interesting is I had this dialogue recently with a client of mine who was talking about that whole concept of waiting a year. And the philosophy that they were sort of talking about was, but I've lived this empty, lonely existence for years now, because that's part of what I think brings people to a place where they say, I need a divorce, is that they have been feeling just really alone for so long. And they were saying, part of what they did, And I think we could play around with this of whether or not it was a good thing or a bad thing or what it was. But they chose not to do any of that. They said, what I want to do is find out, do I have value to someone of the opposite sex? And they went out and they started dating. They got online, they did those things. And what they found is that there were women, this was a gentleman, there were women that was absolutely interested in him, not just because of what he did, but who he was, that he was this giving guy. And he lived for so long really believing that there would be no one that would be interested in him. And the dating piece, though, for him was practice, was really about learning about what dating was like, learning about how to have a relationship, finding those things out. And I believe very much it was a healthy thing for him. But the caveat with it was he didn't see it as long-term relationships. He went into it saying, the reason I'm doing this is to just learn about me as a partner. And I didn't want to do a long-term relationship. I didn't want to move in with one, but I wanted to practice this. And I don't think it's necessarily that bad of an idea. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I like that because, again, it wasn't the fact that he was feeling like I'm less of a person, I need somebody to complete me,
right?
Or sometimes I even feel like relationships are almost like addictions, that when one is pulled away from you, it's like a craving, like we've got to have this back, we've got to replace this, I've got to put in what was lost. And it sounds like what you're saying in his case, that was not the issue. It was more about, again, just to kind of, it was almost like a training ground for him to put himself out there and just to see. And, I guess the only thing I would say about that is that I'm hoping that in some ways he was able to be honest with the people that he was with.
Right.
Just in some ways to give them a clue that at some point, I know you don't want to, on the first date, you're probably not going to do something like that. But, if you're able to catch it as you feel like things may be progressing, just to have, I guess, compassion for that other person. But I think, as long as you've kind of got that covered, I think that could be an interesting idea and an interesting way to kind of go about it.
He was incredibly honest. As a matter of fact, he let people know right away that he wasn't interested in a long-term relationship, that he was interested in meeting people, to developing friendships, to having people to go do things with, that he was recently divorced. So, yeah, the ethics and the morals were right in place for him. That doesn't necessarily mean that the people he was dating did think they could change his idea.
Yeah, right.
But I think it's just a very interesting discussion to really talk about when we've been in a relationship for so long, and so many people end up divorced after many, many years. It's really sad when that happens. But we really lose, and you really alluded to this when you were talking about yourself, you really lose who you are because we get caught up into these vicious, negative interactions in which we become at times something so different than what our core is. And we want to learn and we want to find out, can I be with another human being and just be kind? And I think we forget sometimes that when you're in this negative, empty, lonely relationship, your whole world looks dismal, and including how you feel about yourself.
Yeah, I agree completely. And it's interesting you kind of bring up that, I guess, negativity bias about, when things aren't going the way you'd like them, you do kind of have the negativity sunglasses on, if you will. And I was actually just talking to a couple last night about that I think one of them mentioned that her husband had brought flowers to her, and her response to that was something like, well, that's great, but you haven't done that in 10 years. Or, I've also heard something like, yeah.
No, I'm laughing because I want you to finish your story and then I'll share mine, but I had the exact experience last evening.
Interesting. Yeah, it is. It's very common. And yeah, and I was going to say also, in addition, she's also said things, and she admitted to this. She said, I've said things before to him when he's done something nice of, well, what's going on? What haven't you told me? Or what are you hiding? That kind of a thing. And, talked a little bit about me on the outside being a neutral party. I might see something like that as, wow, that's a positive. Look at that. He brought flowers home. That's such a nice thing to do. But again, when you've got all this negativity swirling, you can't even see anymore the things that are positively kind of going on in the relationship. So, yeah, it's definitely one that I see quite a bit.
Yeah, it's the toxic thinking that really you get caught up with. And it's really sad because you do see couples coming in and you see that they have such a strength about them. They look like a couple that should be able to really understand how important they are to each other. And then when you make a suggestion or something and they come out with things like, well, the only reason you did that is because the counselor told you to.
Right. Yeah.
Instead of looking at this, and I recently wrote an article, I don't think it's come out yet, but on an attitude of gratitude and really understanding that when you have a partner, whether it's from a counseling perspective or whether it's from reading a book or seeing something or watching my videos, and they're willing to take a risk to really be able to stretch themselves and do something that they don't ordinarily do. And the reason they're doing it is because their love for you is so strong. To be able to take that in, and if we come from these past relationships in which we didn't feel valued, we didn't feel seen, and we haven't really looked at what didn't I do in this relationship, the autopsy that you were talking about a few minutes ago, you never really know, what do we need to do now? How do we make this, how do we stop ourselves from discounting what our partner is doing or taking a risk to do something you don't ordinarily do?
Yeah, that's right. And I was just thinking about the whole flower issue that we were talking about. And a lot of times I'll tell people, how nice would it be if you did just stop at just saying, wow, thank you so much. That was really nice. Like, isn't that so much easier and so many fewer words, but so much power than actually continuing on to say, well, but, or, well, you did this. And it's like, I just tell them, isn't that a lot more work?
Right. And I like to say, how are you benefiting from not accepting it? And usually it's about protecting myself, protecting from getting hurt. Yeah. And one of the things, and I'd like to hear your sort of perspective on this, part of the challenge of starting over and getting into a remarriage is really about taking that risk again. And how do you make sure for yourselves that it's worth the risk?
Yeah, that's a good one because, I think it can be a little bit more complicated, but really I don't think it's complication. I think it's just things that are so much more ingrained in people that have not only had childhoods where they've had issues happen, but then they've had previous relationships where maybe some of those same things happen. I talk to people all the time that, well, my father, was always having affairs on my mother, and that's kind of what I grew up with. And then my first husband, guess what? The same thing happened. And just think about how ingrained that becomes into the next relationship. And you start to see things that maybe aren't really there or not giving the benefit of the doubt. That's definitely something that can happen. I'll tell you just from my own experience, my current wife kind of had a little bit of that situation in a previous relationship. And she found it very hard to give me the benefit of the doubt. It was almost like every little thing that I did, if it was just not exactly what she thought it should be, her mind immediately went to, there must be something going on here. And It definitely took a lot of communication, a lot of reassurance on my part, even me being transparent, which was something that I didn't probably do enough of when I was younger and in my first marriage, but I knew the importance of that. So it might be something like, hey, honey, my coworker has asked to go out to a meeting at such and such a time. What do you think about that? And, if she had a problem with it, then we would try to work a solution and try to do something different. And I think just over time, because I would go to her proactively with some of these things, it was able to really, I think, pull those issues kind of out of her and then, to the door, if you will.
So the transparency piece that you talked about just a moment ago, was that something that you realized by doing that sort of retro relationship autopsy that allowed you to see these are something that I didn't do in my marriage, and this relationship I'm going to make sure that I am? Or was that just related to her?
Yeah, no, it was definitely something I think that I learned. And then, I think just again with the issues that she was having, it kind of pulled that out of me. But I would say more so was because of my prior relationship. I definitely, I think, was maybe a little bit more closely guarded, maybe had walls up a little bit more, which is interesting because normally you'll hear people talk about walls kind of coming up in relationships that are subsequent to one that you had the difficulty with. But for whatever reason, with me, it was the opposite. Right. So, and that may have, if I think about it, may have gone back to some childhood issues where my parents were divorced and I had a lot to deal with there. And it was, very difficult for me you're feeling like you're taking sides. And so instead of taking sides, you just put up a wall. And so, again, I think that may have happened in my first relationship, but kind of bringing that down. So, yeah, I would say for the most part, it was more me, I think, learning that than anything.
And one of the things I like to tell folks also is when we start talking about starting over or getting into a new relationship, one of the things that I think is critical is that people have to recognize what are their, number one, what are the needs that they have for feeling love? What are the things that they need? And secondly, when we look for a new partner, a prospective partner, we want to make sure that these are people that do also feel like they can meet the needs that you have in the way that you need them. And I think one of the advantages of going through an experience like a divorce is really about you understand the pain, so that the hope would be that you take the time you need to really learn about your partner. And if you can be transparent, if you can be authentic, if you can talk about the things that you need and look at your own part of your past relationship, being authentic, being retrospective, and saying, I know that I did some things I shouldn't have done, and in this relationship, I'm not going to allow that. And here's the key, I think. And share all of those insights when you're first dating someone. And so that together, it starts right away with the two of you building a life that you both want, that you both need, and recognize that you both have some struggles to go through. Because I think more often than not, when you start over, you're going to find someone who's also been married before. And I love, there's a song that I know, there's a line in it that's just so perfect, which is, I'm looking for someone whose baggage fits into mine. Isn't that a great line?
Yeah, that is.
And isn't that what we really need from a new relationship? And that's the power of that we fit together, that we're able to share it, and that we're building this as a couple. That to me is beautiful.
Yeah, I love that. And I was just thinking as you were talking, I mean, and you may have mentioned this in our conversation earlier, but about core values. I mean, they're so important. And I don't think we do enough work on that to understand what our individual core values are, but then also get to know what our partner's core values are, and getting to know those earlier, in the relationship. And, if folks are, not sure, like, what's a core value or how do I figure that out? You can literally just go online and put in core values, and there's all sorts of great websites that'll give you just big lists of core values and you can kind of go through and pick, 3 to 5 that really mean something to you. So, for example, a couple core values for me are honesty and loyalty. And I'd say they actually match pretty well with my current wife. And so I think just knowing those things in the beginning was very helpful. So then I could drive a lot of what I do, a lot of the decisions that I make, a lot of our communications around those core values. And so knowing, just like you said earlier, I was better able to meet her needs. She could meet my needs. And so I think the key there is just really have open and honest communication about it. And I think for us, in my relationship, I don't necessarily know that we actually did something specific like that, an exercise, but I think just the open and honest communication and lots of it to work through things. I think over time, those core values just started to bubble up, and we became completely aware of each of those with each other. So that's, I would say, for folks listening, that's really important.
Well, we're just about out of time for today, and I want to make sure that I, speaking of gratitude, tell you how much I appreciate you coming on, putting aside the time to really share with my audience your expertise, your heart. But before we end, I wanted to ask one last question of you, which is, as you've done this work and the learning that you've had and your personal reflection and professional reflection, what do you think is the one thing in your life or that surprised you that you found out about yourself?
Yeah, I think for me, definitely, I'm very independent. I'm very individualistic. That's kind of always the way I've been. Like, I've always wanted to do things on my own. No, I can take care of this. I don't need any help. And what I found, especially after sort of that disintegration of that first relationship, is that I need connection. I need other people. I need support. And so I did a lot of reaching out to people. Like, I had a church small group that I became a part of where, and the interesting thing real quickly is that it was filled with nothing but couples and me. And so talk about feeling a little bit out of my element. But, but I have to say, like, they were very welcoming, very encouraging to me, and made me feel a part of the group. And so that was very important. So I think, again, just community, getting support, and reaching out, I think, were the things that I took away. And that's something that I do to this day that I didn't do then, before that.
And not to be afraid to reach out and not feel like people are going to feel bothered if you do. I think that's the other piece of that. Well, thank you once again for coming on. And if people wanted to reach out to you, please share how they can get hold of you, either through your podcast or through your website.
Definitely. My podcast is called The Remarried Life, and that's at theremarriedlife.com. Or you can go to my website, and I actually just changed the URL recently, but it's richmondmarriagecounseling.com, and you can find me there. And so, I'd love to connect.
And please know, everyone, that I will have Brian's information on our show notes, as well as a summary of the episode. So thanks again, Brian, and I really appreciate you coming on, and we'll see you in the digital world.
That's right. Thanks so much, Stuart. It's been a pleasure.
Take care. Bye-bye, all of you, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening. This episode has ended, but your journey continues. Head over to www.thecouplesexperts.com to access all the links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive to podcast listeners. Enjoyed this episode? Why not hit subscribe now and never miss an episode?